Picture this: London, 1850s. Gas lamps glow against the fog. Carriages clatter down the cobbled streets. Inside a grand townhouse. The wealthy elite are gathering for an evening of food, gossip, and a corpse. Not just any corpse, mind you. A 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummy, bought on the antiquities market and hauled into the parlor like it's the night's entertainment. Servants roll it in on a long table, candles flicker, champagne glasses clink, and the guests lean forward in anticipation. Tonight, dessert will be served after the mummy is unwrapped. Welcome to the Victorian Mummy Unwrapping Party, where ancient history met social spectacle, and the line between archaeology and theatre blurred into absurdity. The guest list: the attendees were the creme de la creme of Victorian society. Aristocrats, scientists, socialites. The curious rich. Women in silk gowns and men in waistcoats gathered around, clutching opera glasses and handkerchiefs. Some came for science, others for shock value, most for the thrill of saying, "Oh yes. Last night we unwrapped a mummy after dinner." In a time before Netflix, when entertainment meant music recitals or endless rounds of parlor games, nothing screamed exclusivity quite like peeling back the wrappings of a 3,000-year-old corpse in your drawing room. How do you even buy a mummy? Here's where it gets even stranger. Buying a mummy in 19th century Europe wasn't hard. Egypt was under Ottoman control, and its treasures were being stripped by colonial powers and antiquities dealers. Tourists came home with scarabs, papyrus scrolls, and, if they were wealthy enough, entire human remains. In London, Paris, and Vienna, dealers openly advertised genuine mummies for sale. You could buy one at auction, through a private collector, or even from a shady dockside merchant. Some mummies were real, some were fake stuffed with bones. But buyers rarely cared. To own a mummy was a status symbol. To unwrap it in front of your guests, that was prestige on another level. The party atmosphere: now imagine the mood in the parlor. A hush falls as the host, usually a gentleman of science or a collector of curiosities, stands beside the wrapped figure. The mummy lies on a table draped in velvet, its linen wrappings yellowed with centuries. The host gives a little lecture, something about ancient Egyptian embalming, the mysteries of the Nile, the glory of pharaohs. Then, with a flourish, he produces a knife. Gasps ripple through the crowd as he begins to slice the wrappings. Layer after layer of linen is peeled away. Guests lean closer, some gagging at the faint smell of dust and resin, others fascinated. Jewelry, amulets, or scraps of papyrus might be revealed. Each find is held up for inspection like a party trick. And finally, the leathery, shrunken face of the mummy itself stares back, sockets empty, teeth exposed in a death grin. Some guests gasp. Some faint. Others sip their wine and whisper, "How marvelous!" Equal parts science and spectacle to Victorians, this was framed as science. Early archaeology was still developing, and many scholars claimed these events advanced knowledge about embalming, burial practices, and ancient culture. But let's be honest. Most of it was pure spectacle. Guests weren't scribbling notes for academic journals. They were shrieking, gossiping, and clutching each other's arms. The science was an excuse for the thrill. The same way Victorians flocked to public dissections or freak shows. Death, packaged as entertainment. And what a morbid thrill it was. Imagine unwrapping your Christmas presents, but instead of toys and sweets, it's a brittle human hand or a necklace once placed to guard a soul on its journey to the afterlife. The theatricality of death mummy unwrapping parties combined everything Victorians loved: exoticism, death, and theatre. The East was romanticized as mysterious and decadent. The dead body was both horrifying and irresistible. And the act of unwrapping, of literally peeling back history, was theatrical in itself. It was the perfect cocktail of morbid curiosity, and it fit neatly into the Victorian obsession with spiritualism, séances, and the thin line between the living and the dead. For an evening, the parlor became a stage. The mummy the star performer, and the guests the audience of a macabre play. The irony of it all now, Let's pause here for the obvious question. Did anyone stop to think, hey, maybe cutting open a 3,000-year-old corpse for fun is deeply disrespectful? The answer is no. Not really. In the imperial mindset of the Victorians, Egypt was a land to be plundered, studied, and consumed. Its relics weren't seen as sacred remains but as trophies of empire. To them, this wasn't desecration. It was curiosity, entitlement, and entertainment rolled into one. Setting the stage for the story, this is where our tale begins. With wealthy Victorians sipping champagne in candlelit parlors, eagerly watching as history itself was unwrapped before their eyes. They weren't archaeologists. They weren't scientists. They were voyeurs of the past, indulging in the most bizarre dinner party entertainment ever invented. In the next section, we'll explore why Victorians became so obsessed with Egypt in the first place. Because this wasn't just about unwrapping bodies, it was part of a cultural fever known as Egyptomania, where everything Egyptian became fashionable, from obelisks to eyeliner. But for now, just hold on to that image. A Victorian parlor filled with silk and velvet, the laughter of the wealthy echoing around the room. And at the center of it all, a 3,000-year-old mummy being unwrapped like an after-dinner surprise. Because in the age of empire, even the dead weren't safe from becoming party tricks. If you think unwrapping a corpse in your drawing room sounds odd, you have to remember this. Victorians were obsessed with Egypt. Absolutely, hopelessly obsessed. This wasn't a casual interest. This was Egyptomania, a cultural fever that gripped Europe and America in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it explains why buying a mummy and slicing it open in front of your dinner guests felt not only acceptable, but fashionable. Napoleon, scholars, and the spark of obsession. The craze began in the late 18th century, when Napoleon invaded Egypt. Alongside his army, he brought scholars, artists, and scientists who documented every temple, obelisk, and artifact they could find. Their published work, Description de l'Egypte, was a hit back in Europe. Suddenly, ancient Egypt wasn't just a distant land of biblical mystery. It was real, exotic, and full of treasures waiting to be claimed. From that moment, Egypt wasn't just geography. It was a brand. And Victorians, with their love of spectacle and empire, couldn't resist. Mummies as status symbols. Soon, mummies began flooding into Europe. They were shipped out of Egypt by the hundreds, sometimes legally, sometimes smuggled, often sold by locals eager to profit from colonial demand. In London auction houses, you could pick up a mummy the way you might buy fine furniture. To own one was to show wealth, education, and refinement, a talking point, a centerpiece for your curiosity cabinet. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of showing off your Tesla, except instead of an electric car, it was a 3,000-year-old body in your dining room. Egyptian style everywhere. Egyptomania wasn't just about bodies. It seeped into everything. Architecture, obelisks were shipped to Europe and plopped into parks. Cemeteries sprouted faux Egyptian tombs and pyramids. Fashion, Egyptian motifs appeared on jewelry, gowns, and even wallpaper. Entertainment, traveling exhibitions displayed sarcophagi, amulets, and relics, with showmen giving dramatic lectures. Victorians saw Egypt as glamorous, mysterious, and timeless. To host a mummy unwrapping party wasn't just about shock value. It was about placing yourself at the center of the latest cultural craze. Science, showbiz, or both. Here's where things get murky. The Victorians claimed their mummy unwrappings were scientific. The truth? They were half science, half theater. Yes, doctors and scholars attended, and occasionally they made careful notes about embalming techniques or burial customs. But for every surgeon carefully cataloguing artifacts, there were 10 guests giggling, fainting, or sneaking pieces of bandage as souvenirs. Some mummy unwrappings were organized by respected Egyptologists. Others were hosted by rich dilettantes who just wanted to shock their guests. The line between research and party trick blurred until it vanished. Why the fascination with the dead? So why mummies, specifically? Why not just collect jewelry or papyrus scrolls? Part of it was the Victorians' complicated relationship with death. This was the same society that photographed their dead relatives, held séances in parlors, and built elaborate cemeteries filled with mausoleums. Death wasn't hidden away. It was a spectacle, a fascination, sometimes even a form of entertainment. Combine that with exoticism and empire, and you have the perfect recipe for mummy fever. Egyptians weren't seen as individuals with sacred burial traditions. They were props in a Victorian play about science, empire, and curiosity. The mummy trade. By the height of Egyptomania, the mummy trade had become a booming business. Dealers hawked them openly in Cairo markets. Some were sold whole, others broken up for parts. Believe it or not, powdered mummy was even ground up and sold as medicine in Europe well into the 19th century. People swallowed it, hoping to absorb ancient vitality. Spoiler: it didn't work. For wealthier Victorians, though, swallowing mummies wasn't enough. They wanted the full experience. They wanted to peel back the layers of time with their own hands. And so the mummy unwrapping party became the pinnacle of Egyptomania, the ultimate parlor game. The respectability angle now. If you're thinking this all sounds grotesque and barbaric, you're right. But the Victorians were masters of justifying their hobbies. They cloaked the unwrapping parties in the language of science and education. Oh, we're not desecrating a corpse for fun. We're advancing knowledge. We're studying embalming. We're doing important cultural work. It was pseudo-archaeology wrapped in respectability. And society lapped it up. Newspapers even advertised these events, and attending one was a mark of sophistication. A party trick with consequences, but Egyptomania had a darker side. The frenzy for relics meant that countless tombs were looted, bodies destroyed, and artifacts scattered across the globe. Priceless heritage was lost to parlors and drawing rooms, to satisfy the curiosity of guests sipping sherry and stifling nervous giggles. To Victorians, this was harmless entertainment. To Egyptians, it was grave robbery on an industrial scale. Closing of Section 2. So that's the world that gave birth to the mummy unwrapping party. A world of Egyptomania, where coffins were commodities, and corpses were curiosities. Where the line between science and spectacle blurred under the flickering glow of gaslight. In the next section, we'll step into the party itself. We'll watch the knives cut linen, the amulets glimmer, the guests gasp, and the face of the ancient dead stare back at its new Victorian audience. Because if Section 2 showed us the obsession, Section 3 will show us the performance. The guests are seated. The candles burn low. The mummy lies at the center of the parlor, its yellowed wrappings glinting under the light. The host clears his throat. Maybe he's a gentleman scholar. Maybe a collector with too much money and too little taste. Either way, he gestures to the table and declares, "Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we shall peer into the very face of antiquity." And with that, the knives come out. The first cut unwrapping a mummy was no delicate procedure. There were no gloves, no sterile instruments, no careful conservation techniques. This wasn't archaeology, this was show business. The host would slice into the linen with dramatic flair, pulling away strips that had been wound centuries earlier. Guests leaned forward, gasping as the layers fell. Each strip was tossed aside like confetti at the strangest party you can imagine. Sometimes, the wrappings revealed nothing but dust. Other times, there were amulets, small charms meant to protect the dead. When these appeared, the host would hold them up proudly, showing them off to the crowd. Some guests clapped. Others fainted. Guests the reactions varied. Aristocratic ladies swooned, clutching lace handkerchiefs to their noses. Gentlemen leaned in, eager for a better view. Young debutantes whispered nervously, torn between horror and fascination. One woman wrote in her diary that she couldn't decide whether the sight was most instructive or most appalling. Another confessed she could still smell the resin and decay days after. But nobody left. Nobody turned away. The grotesque was irresistible. Treasures and trinkets every now and then. The host would hit the jackpot. Rings, scarabs, fragments of jewelry, all were pocketed by collectors. Guests sometimes bribed servants for scraps of bandages to take home as morbid souvenirs. Imagine sipping tea the next day and proudly telling a friend, "Oh, this little strip of cloth? It's from the mummy we unwrapped last night." The casual looting was all part of the thrill. These weren't seen as sacred objects, but as conversation pieces. The dead had been reduced to after-dinner party favors. The smell of history, and then there was the smell. Accounts describe a pungent, choking odor. A mix of resin, dust, and ancient decay. Some guests covered their faces with scented cloths. Others pretended not to notice. But everyone remembered it. The odor gave the performance its edge. It wasn't just history you could see, it was history you could smell. Proof, in the most visceral way possible, that this body was real. The face revealed eventually. After layer upon layer of linen, the moment of climax arrived, the face. A leathery mask of shriveled skin. Hollow eye sockets. Teeth bared in a permanent grin. Some skulls still had strands of hair clinging on. Others looked almost waxy, preserved by the embalming resin. The room would fall silent. Some guests screamed. Others stared in awe. The host, relishing the drama, would pause here, letting the weight of centuries sink in. Here was a human being who once walked the banks of the Nile. Now reduced to a spectacle in a London parlor. A mix of horror and amusement. It was grotesque, yes. But it was also theater. People described these moments with the same language they used for plays or operas. Dramatic, thrilling, unforgettable. For some, it was almost spiritual, a communion with the ancient past. For others, it was just the thrill of seeing something shocking, the 19th century equivalent of a horror movie. Either way, everyone went home talking about it. Science or circus? Of course, defenders claimed it was science. Doctors examined the body, commenting on embalming methods, taking notes on bone structure. But the reality was clear. The science was an excuse for entertainment. True archaeologists cringed at these spectacles, knowing how much damage was being done. Every linen strip tossed aside was evidence lost. Every amulet pocketed was a theft. But in the drawing room, none of that mattered. This was Victorian science, equal parts curiosity, arrogance, and spectacle. The aftermath: when the unwrapping ended, the guests returned to their drinks. The mummy, now stripped bare, was sometimes displayed in the host's home. Other times, the remains were discarded, even burned. A body preserved for millennia could be destroyed in a single evening of parlor entertainment. Guests left buzzing, gossiping, and sometimes carrying little fragments of history in their pockets. For them, it was an unforgettable night. For the mummy, it was the end of eternity. Setting up the next section, the unwrapping was the climax. But it was also just one act in a broader Victorian performance. Behind the spectacle lay a strange justification. The belief that this was not only entertainment but education. That by desecrating these ancient bodies, Victorians were advancing science. In the next section, we'll peel back that justification. We'll look at the bizarre pseudoscience, the quack cures, and the ways Victorians convinced themselves that grinding up and unwrapping the dead was perfectly respectable. Because in their world, onions weren't the only ridiculous cures. Sometimes the cure was powdered mummy. After the gasps, after the unwrapping, after the guests pocketed their little strips of linen, the host would often clear his throat and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have witnessed tonight is not merely a parlor trick. It is science." And the Victorians believed it. Or at least, they wanted to. Because if you were going to cut open an ancient corpse in your parlor while ladies fainted into their lace shawls, you needed a respectable excuse. And that excuse was pseudoscience. Archaeology. The Victorian way archaeology in the mid-19th century wasn't the careful, methodical discipline we think of today. There were no conservation labs, no preservation standards, no ethics committees. Archaeology was more like treasure hunting in fancy clothes. Digging up tombs, smashing open coffins, shipping mummies back to Europe. All of it was justified as discovery. The Victorians framed it as noble scholarship, the pursuit of knowledge. But in reality, it was looting with Latin footnotes. The unwrapping parties fit neatly into this culture. Scholars argued that they were studying embalming techniques, burial customs, even ancient diseases. But any genuine data was destroyed in the process. The bandages, the amulets, the delicate layers of resin, all lost in a single evening's performance. One Egyptologist later compared these parties to burning a library to read by the light of the flames. The medicine of the dead, but science didn't stop at curiosity. Believe it or not, Victorians also saw mummies as medicine. For centuries in Europe, ground-up mummy flesh had been sold as a cure for everything from headaches to epilepsy. Apothecaries stocked jars of mummia, a powder made from Egyptian corpses. Doctors prescribed it. Patients swallowed it. Royals bought it at premium prices. By the 19th century, the practice had waned, but echoes of it remained. Some still believed that consuming ancient flesh offered healing power. Others smeared mummy ointments on wounds. And while unwrapping parties weren't about eating mummies, they carried the same undercurrent. The idea that Egyptian dead could serve the needs of the living. It was medicine, spectacle, and exploitation all rolled into one. The showmen of science. Not all mummy unwrappings were hosted by aristocrats. Some were run by professionals who blurred the line between scholar and showman. Take Thomas Pettigrew. Nicknamed Mummy Pettigrew. A London surgeon and antiquarian, he built a reputation on public mummy unwrappings. His events drew huge crowds, part lecture, part carnival. He published detailed notes on what he found, claiming it was science, but he was also selling tickets. For Pettigrew, mummies weren't just specimens. They were business. He transformed funerary remains into a commodity, an early mix of archaeology and performance art. His unwrappings were essentially the TED Talks of Victorian morbidity, only with more bandages and fewer PowerPoint slides. Egypt as exotic theatre. The Victorians loved to cloak their obsessions in exoticism. To them, Egypt was mysterious, decadent, and distant, a place of pharaohs, curses, and secrets waiting to be revealed. Unwrapping a mummy wasn't just about the corpse. It was about peeling back the mystery of the Orient. It played into imperial fantasies of domination. The idea that Britain could own, dissect, and display the ancient world. Every slice of linen was a statement of power, over history, over culture, and even over death itself. A lesson in justification, of course. Not everyone was fooled. Some scholars criticized the waste. A few even argued it was sacrilege. But for the most part, society excused it. Why? Because the Victorians were masters of justification. If something was entertaining, they'd call it educational. If it was grotesque, they'd call it medical. If it was grave robbing, they'd call it empire. And mummy unwrappings ticked all three boxes. The myth of the mummy's curse adding fuel to the spectacle was the growing myth of the mummy's curse. By the late 19th century, rumors swirled that disturbing Egyptian tombs brought bad luck, even death. Newspaper stories exaggerated accidents, illnesses, and strange coincidences around explorers who'd handled mummies. For party hosts, the curse added extra drama. Imagine unwrapping a corpse in your parlor while whispering, "Careful. They say those who disturb the dead suffer their wrath." Guests shivered, but they still leaned closer. The danger only made it more thrilling. The damage done. Here's the sad truth. In their eagerness to entertain, the Victorians destroyed countless artifacts. Linen burned, amulets pocketed, bodies left to crumble. Priceless data about embalming and burial practices was lost forever. Modern Egyptologists look back in horror. The information that could have been preserved with modern techniques was obliterated in an evening of parlor theatrics. What we know about ancient Egypt today is less than what we could have known, thanks to the cavalier knives of Victorian hosts. A toast to ignorance, but for the guests at the time, none of that mattered. They left the party chattering, thrilled, scandalized, and entertained. To them, it was proof that they were sophisticated, worldly, and at the cutting edge of culture. Science had given them permission to enjoy a corpse as entertainment. And they took full advantage. Closing of section 4. So here we have it. Mummy unwrapping parties weren't just about curiosity. They were about pseudoscience wrapped in spectacle, about medicine that was really cannibalism, about empire disguised as education. It was a cultural performance, one that told the Victorians they were rational explorers, even as they tore history to pieces. In the final section, we'll look at the legacy. How these grotesque parties shaped archaeology, how Egyptomania left scars on history, and why the mummy still haunts Western imagination, not just in museums, but in Hollywood curses and Halloween masks. Because while the parties are long gone, the fascination they fed is very much alive. So the knives have been put away. The guests have gone home, buzzing about the spectacle. The mummy lies in tatters, wrappings torn, amulets stolen. Centuries of preservation undone in a single evening of Victorian theatre. The question is, what did all of this leave behind? What legacy did mummy unwrapping parties carve into history? The answer, as with most bizarre traditions, is complicated. It's part horror story, part cautionary tale, and part foundation for the Egypt we know in popular culture today. The archaeological wreckage first, the damage. Let's be blunt, the Victorians destroyed priceless knowledge. Every time a mummy was unwrapped for entertainment, information was lost. The linen wrappings, carefully layered by embalmers, contained clues about materials, trade routes, and techniques. Amulets were placed in specific patterns, each carrying symbolic meaning. Resin residues told stories about embalming chemistry. All of that was tossed aside like party streamers. The Victorians didn't care about context. They cared about spectacle. As a result, modern Egyptologists have to work with fragments of what survived the frenzy. One scholar famously said, "The Victorians opened 1,000 coffins and closed 1,000 books of history." The birth of public archaeology, and yet, ironically, the unwrapping parties also helped spark genuine archaeology. They stirred public interest in Egypt, fueling museums, expeditions, and research. Without that fascination, grotesque as it was, perhaps Egyptology wouldn't have gained the momentum it did. Think of it this way, unwrapping parties were like the messy, awkward adolescence of archaeology. Embarrassing in hindsight, destructive in practice, but formative in the long run. The cursed legacy. Then there's the fascination with the mummy's curse. Victorians loved spooky stories, and the idea that disturbing the dead brought misfortune added a delicious chill to the unwrapping. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers were printing tales of cursed mummies causing shipwrecks, accidents, and mysterious deaths. When Tutankhamun's tomb was opened in 1922 and Lord Carnarvon died shortly after, the press went wild. The curse narrative exploded, and it all traces back to Victorian Egyptomania. So the next time you see a Halloween decoration labeled Cursed Mummy, you can thank the parlor parties that first made mummies into horror icons. From parlors to pop culture, the mummy didn't stay in London parlors. It marched into pop culture. Novels. 19th century writers spun tales of revived mummies wreaking havoc. Stage shows. Theaters staged mummy revivals as exotic plays. Films. By the 20th century, Universal Pictures' The Mummy cemented the corpse in bandages as a monster. Without the grotesque Victorian appetite for corpse theatre, we might never have had Boris Karloff's mummy shuffling across the silver screen, or Brendan Fraser punching undead priests in the 1999 reboot. The ethical reckoning today. Museums and scholars view mummy unwrapping as a crime against heritage. Excavations are carefully controlled, conservation is prioritized, and human remains are treated with respect. But the shadow of Victorian parties lingers as a warning. Every time you see a mummy in a museum, remember, countless others never made it past the parlor. They were cut open, stripped bare, and discarded so a few dozen Victorians could clap politely between sips of sherry. Egypt itself has since pushed for the return of looted artifacts, sparking debates about repatriation. The unwrapping parties symbolize the arrogance of empire, the belief that other cultures' dead could be used as playthings. A strange kind of immortality, and yet, despite the horror, the mummies themselves achieved a strange immortality. For thousands of years, they lay undisturbed, forgotten by history. Then the Victorians hauled them into the spotlight, transforming them into symbols of exotic mystery. The practice was grotesque, but it ensured that mummies became cultural icons. Not just ancient remains, but permanent fixtures in Western imagination. To this day, the word mummy carries layers of meaning. History, horror, Halloween, cinema, curses, and yes, Victorian absurdity. Final reflection. So what's the legacy of the mummy unwrapping party? It's a legacy of contradictions. It destroyed history, but also sparked archaeology. It desecrated the dead, but also immortalized them in popular culture. It revealed Victorian curiosity, but also Victorian arrogance. At its core, it reminds us that history isn't just written in textbooks. Sometimes it's written in parlors, with candles flickering, champagne flowing, and wealthy Victorians slicing into the skin of the ancient dead. It's horrifying. It's absurd. It's unforgettable. And that's